Greetings, everybody, and welcome along. It is just after 8 o'clock on the evening of May the 5th, 2025, and it is our weekly Q&A session. So bring your questions. We have some submitted via email, some via Twitter or X, and some will just come through on the chat. So we will dive straight into this and do our customary greetings to those in the chat so far. So we have tonight, we are on Rumble, on Locals, on YouTube, on Twitch, and of course on the now renamed X platform. So be sure to follow us on all of those. I will just make sure that we are being appropriately viewed. Yes, we are. So be sure to like and share and subscribe if you have not done so already. So we will be going through your questions tonight, but first some greetings. So good evening to Comrade Davey in the chat, Pavel out there in Austria, Evgeny Nikolaev, good evening to you. Yu Wan joins us from Phoenix, Arizona. Thomas Smitherman joins us from Old Virginia, which I am told refers is a lyric from an old state song which isn't sung anymore. Type it into Google, you'll find out why. Right. Right, so we have some questions coming in already, so I will get to those. So Evgeny asks, do you think the EU, NATO will open a second front in some of the Baltic countries? Well, first of all, never make bold predictions. That's possibly a lesson everybody should learn. But when assessing the possibilities of NATO, or more specifically the US or the British, opening up something in the Baltic states, you have to ask what's the realistic prospects of that in terms of military developments. Now, one of the reasons why they were, that is, the US and the British imperialists were so into the Ukraine project, is because Ukraine is a difficult country to conquer militarily. Not because it had a gigantic population. I mean, its population was only around about 40 million a decade ago. So it's got it's a sizable population, but by no means gigantic. The problem is, of course, it's got a gigantic amount of space. It's a very big country. It's difficult to advance across, difficult to hold all of it. Very easy with its gigantic borders with multiple countries to slip in all kinds of terrorist operations. It has a very, very long border with Russia, which is very difficult to defend from the Russian point of view. That gave it a lot of advantages. It's also why they were mad on the idea, or very keen on the idea, of subordinating Belarus under some compradors and having that be a front against the Russians as well. That, thankfully, did not work. And Tikhanovskaya was chased out of Belarus, and deservedly so. But Ukraine has these advantages for the NATO side. And these are advantages which the Baltic states lack. Baltic states are not particularly big. They have small and diminishing populations. They have no industrial base whatsoever. They would be very difficult to resupply in the event of a war with the Russians. Whereas Ukraine, because it has these very long borders with Poland and with Romania and with Slovakia, and is relatively easy to reach in its western quarter, not by air, but by rail or road, then that has certain advantages. You can resupply Ukraine. It would be tremendously difficult to resupply the Baltic states, meaning that if you provoked something in the Baltic states, which is possible, it would be very difficult to sustain it. Ukraine could be sustained because it has these links to the West, transport links to the West. And therefore, it is much less advantageous to start something in Latvia, Lithuania, or Estonia. Because if the Russians really wanted to, they could storm those places within a few hours. There's practically, the militaries of these countries are practically non-existent. The Russians could wipe them out in a matter of hours. The amount of forces that the US, the British, the Germans, or the French could get into the Baltic states are quite small. The Baltic states could be very easily choked off by the Russians from the sea or the air, um, in terms of the Russian air defense umbrella. These all lack the advantages that Ukraine has. And so, for those reasons, and certain other reasons as well, which I'll go into in just a moment, I think from a military point of view, from the limited knowledge that I have, I think it would be an extremely hard task for them to have the kind of effect that the NATO bloc is looking for. Ukraine was uniquely positioned to be a test of the Russian Federation, partially because of the very long links between Ukraine and Russia. I mean, but the Kiev and Rus being the starting point for both nations, the fact that the Orthodox Church came out partially of Ukraine, the fact that Ukraine and Russia are so interrelated to each other, basically makes this into a version of a civil war. And you have also the fact that the Ukrainian and the Russian capitalist class were very well integrated with each other for a long time. And of course you have the fact that there was still a Soviet patriotism that existed in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass and other areas, which, despite the best efforts of both the Ukrainian and the Russian bourgeoisies, still existed. All of these, and combined with the geographical advantages that Ukraine has, made it tremendously difficult, in terms of the potential challenge that a Ukraine that was fully incorporated into the NATO structures, which Ukraine at the moment is, to be defeated quickly by the Russians. The whole idea of the Ukraine war was that, well, they knew very well, as I have emphasized on many occasions, that it would be very difficult for the Ukrainians to score an outright military victory over the Russians, if not impossible. But it would be possible for the Ukrainians, with full assistance from the NATO bloc, to cause embarrassing defeats, which could be spun into PR victories for the NATO side. And combined with the sanctions and political pressure, would be enough to cause major political problems for the Russians. And these are the advantages that the Ukraine war has, and that Ukraine has for the US and the British. The Baltic states don't have those advantages. And more to the point, the whole point of the Ukraine war was to be able to, once it became obvious it was going to be a long war, to spin it out as long as you could. You can't do that with the Baltic states. The Russians would end it, I think, quite quickly and quite rapidly and quite brutally. There is none of the sentimental associations that Russians have with Ukraine with the Baltic states. There was, of course, the long period where the Baltic states were part of the USSR, but the Baltic states have been rabid anti-communist and anti-Russian outposts for 30 years. And there's none of the, as I said, the sentimental attachment which many Russians have for Ukraine. That doesn't exist when it comes to the Baltic states. I think if they provoked a war, the Russians would just destroy them militarily within a few hours, and that wouldn't stretch the Russians in the way that the NATO bloc is looking for. Also, it would be a very big risk of a military humiliation, and one that will be very difficult to respond to. So, for instance, if the NATO bloc puts a bunch of soldiers in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, then stages a provocation, then hopes that somehow they'll be able to resupply those forces. Excuse me. They wouldn't be able to do it. The Russians have also been increasing the power of their Baltic fleet in recent years, and of course have significant air capacities which are much more local to the area than the NATO forces. Then you've got the problem of, like, well, what do you do once your initial provocation against the Russians goes wrong and goes tits up? What happens then? Do you then try and resupply from Poland? Do you then try and strike at Kaliningrad? What happens then? Given that the Russians have built new armies that now sit on the border with Norway, Sweden, and Finland, and could easily stretch around and whack the Baltic states and whack Poland as well. So this is, I think, a non-starter. The Americans, and I cannot emphasize this enough, have always feared, as do the British, as do the French, as do the Germans. They do fear the Russian military, and they do fear what the Russians could do to them if they really dialed it up. Now, some might say, then why are they engaging in so many provocations? They're engaging in so many provocations because they're desperate. They're desperate for this war to be won, and they're not going to take the risk of a direct toe-to-toe encounter with the Russian military, because they are afraid that they will lose and be humiliated, and that will cause a systemic collapse at home. Now a war involving the Baltic states would just be over in a quick and brutal fashion, and would further compound the humiliating defeat of the NATO forces. So I don't think there's any advantages that the NATO bloc would gain by staging a provocation in the Baltic states, and therefore I don't think that they'll do it. I think all it's taken is the Russians beefing up their forces in the Baltic and in Kaliningrad and on the border with Finland, and that's enough to put them off. Now, the rabid dogs in Riga and Vilnius and Tallinn might scream and bark around the clock, but they don't have any power of their own, and they would be signing their own death warrants if they chose to provoke a war against the Russians. I have no doubt that if they were under orders to do it, that this absolute collection of comprador scum would sacrifice the Baltic states in a heartbeat if their masters in London and Washington told them to do it. But I think that the masters in Washington and London are too afraid to do it, and therefore I don't think it will happen. Edward asks, how can petty nationalism be combated in West Ukraine, in the Baltics, in Poland? This task seems to be so impossible because people have a personal, emotional connection to petty nationalist ideology. I would say then it has to be combated in the following way, to answer Edward's question. Look, the reason why petty nationalism regrew in Poland, in Western Ukraine, in the Baltic states, is because it was allowed to under the later Soviet period. So the revisionists, the Khrushchevite revisionists, allowed Banderism to regrow in Western Ukraine in particular, and they allowed it because Khrushchev eased in a very opportunistic and wretched fashion, eased the repression that was being waged against the Banderist tendency in Western Ukraine. Prior to the Khrushchev so-called four, which the Westerners love so much because Khrushchev let Western agents out of prison. Prior to that, the USSR was doing a pretty good job of suppressing the petty nationalists, and it was only the fact that basically the USSR stopped the process of both repressing the Banderism and the OUN and the other petty or the wretched reactionary comprador organizations, that these things were allowed to regrow. That and the fact that so the repression was stopped. Also, the ideological struggle against it was slackened off by the confusions of revisionism. And so the fact that in Ukraine and in the Baltics this regrew is a direct consequence of revisionism, meaning that a Marxism-Leninism, if properly applied, and the national patriotic sentiment, if properly applied through Marxism-Leninism, could combat Banderism. So let's use the Baltic states as the example, as I know that the questioner comes from one of the Baltic states. What is the record of the petty nationalists in the Baltic states? And I know that Edward knows this, so it's not necessarily directed at him. But go back and listen to the interviews that I did with Comrade Isko Lat. Go back and listen to what he said about the record of capitalism in the Baltic states. And then go back and look at the record of the development of statehood, of Latvian, Lithuanian, and Estonian statehood under the Soviet Union, even in the revisionist period. The state that existed then, the state that was in the USSR, the states that were in the USSR, were immeasurably superior in every single conceivable way to the states which exist now. Now, the full expression of the statehood of the Baltic nations only existed under the USSR. Prior to the USSR, they were dominated by German imperialism. After the USSR, they were dominated by German, US, and British imperialism. So here's where we get to, the idea of proletarian patriotism. What is the best expression of the nation? What is the best expression of the nation? Because what is the nation? The nation is the people. The nation is the masses. The nation is not some abstract concept. It's not just romantic poetry. It's not just flags. It is the masses. Now, the masses under the Soviet period in all of those countries, including Poland, were doing far better. The bourgeois nationalists of Poland have basically not done quite as appalling a job as the Ukrainian bourgeois, but they've come close. The industrial base of Poland has withered. The petty nationalists are trying desperately to boost the birth rate, which has also dropped significantly after the socialist period. So just compare the results of the horrible period in Poland, which all the petty bourgeois nationalists screamed was like this horrible period of foreign domination. Well, in that case, then why did all the social conditions in Poland improve? If it was this horrible period of like domination by the evil Russian colonialists, why did the condition of the masses improve markedly in all that time? And that's in Poland, which was a system that had more problems than many other places. So again, what is nationalism? So do we go with just the bourgeois definition of nationalism? Because the bourgeois nationalism amounts to this: a romantic covering up of the naked criminality of comprador bourgeois rule. That's what bourgeois nationalism in Poland, the Baltic states, and Ukraine comes to. It's the same as it is in Russia, by the way. Bourgeois restoration in Russia is social degeneration and social murder, waged by the bourgeois, who will destroy a nation whilst waving a flag and screaming about, God, Tsar, and country. But again, what is a nation? The nation is the masses. The nation is the wealth and the health of the nation is the wealth and the health of the masses. Only socialism can ensure the health of the nation, because only socialism can ensure the health and the wealth of the masses. And therefore, all of this shite that is talked by the petty nationalists in Poland, the Baltics, Ukraine, and elsewhere, and the exiled Belarusian petty nationalists, it's all fake. None of them are nationalists. Not really. At best, you could say that they were nationalists on behalf of the bourgeoisie. And if you're not a bourgeois, what on earth are you doing being a nationalist on behalf of the bourgeoisie? Because all that the bourgeois nationalism in these nations now amounts to is a justification for comprador rule. Therefore, it's like flag waving to cover up complete foreign domination. That is the way I would put it. The health and wealth of the nation is measured in the health and the wealth of the masses. And by this measurement, the nationalists in Ukraine, the Baltic states, and Poland have completely and utterly failed, and only socialism can succeed. And then no matter how many lies they tell, no matter how many deceptions they engage in, they can't cover up the actual successes of the socialist period indefinitely, nor can they cover up the manifest and horrendous failures of the capitalist restoration period. Good evening to Comrade Jerry. Luca asks, did you follow the recent local elections in perfidious Albion? Yes, I did. And I was going to do a whole program on this tomorrow, actually. But I will just say a couple of things now. And because if you're not familiar with the local elections in this country, in perfidious Albion, they happened just the other day, last week. And the turnout was total utter crap. It was around about 33%, which is terrible. The big winners, who gained control of 10 councils and grew from 0 to 677 councillors, were Reform, who are the heirs to the Brexit Party and the heirs to UKIP. This is fairly well known by this stage, but I'm just reiterating the point for those who are unfamiliar with it. So local election turnout was awful. It was again around about 33%, down 3% from the previous local election results, and the reason why reform won. Again, turnout was 34%, which is terrible. The local council elections are always terrible, by the way. The reason why reform won isn't because there was this huge upsurge in voting. So the turnout goes down. What happens was that the two major bourgeois parties in Britain collapsed. And so you got a drastic collapse in the Tory vote. So the Tory vote collapsed by 10 percentage points, and the Labour vote collapsed by 14 percentage points. And therefore the reforms vote went up by around about just slightly over the number of percentage points that the Labour Party and the Tories lost. So this isn't the gigantic victory for reform, which many people out there, including like chancers in the multipolar sphere, shall we say, claiming that this is a huge endorsement for Nigel Farage. It's a win by default. It's a win by default because the bourgeois parties collapsed, and deservedly so. Like the Tories and the Labour Party completely deserve the kicking that they got. But what those who voted for reform will find is that reform will make no difference. There will be absolutely no difference made in local government, because essentially local government in Britain has no real powers anymore. It has some, but it's been drained of powers since really the 1980s, because ever since the counter reforms of the Thatcher, Major, Blair, etc. era, of the modern era, local government has been deliberately drained of power, and power has been centralised in the Westminster civil service bureaucracy. And this is because the Tories in the 1980s, correctly from their point of view, identified local government's powers as potentially a barrier to the things they had in mind that they wanted to do, and therefore they stripped local government of a lot of its powers. And since they got stripped of its powers, it's also been shall we say, drained of its resources, as the local tax bases have withered away, central government funding model changed, and so many councils in Britain are either bankrupt or hovering on the edge of bankruptcy. And so what is reform going to do about all this? Well, if you look at reform's actual policies, they're basically like Tories, just right-wing Tories, basically. Slash and burn policies when it comes to the public sector. They, of course, are advocates of fully privatising the NHS. The Labour Party are advocates of fully privatising it, but in a more subtle fashion than reform would do. So the arguments of the Labour Party that they're going to defend the NHS from Farage are a joke. What else would you expect? So disillusionment with the major parties produced a result that was inevitable. Look back 10 years ago and you saw a similar process going on with the UK Independence Party. Like they were the sort of licensed alternative. These are the alternative that the bourgeoisie is very happy with, because they are, beyond all the rhetoric, they are just fundamentally right-wing Tories who would have been perfectly at home in the Conservative Party in the middle 1980s, most of them anyway. And therefore, like, people who voted for them will discover just how little they will change anything very soon. Now, to go back to the UKIP example, they were winning big in local elections a decade ago. They were getting a lot of votes in general elections a decade ago. That petered out because they achieved the Brexit result. The results in the Brexit referendum that they wanted, and the party's purpose was removed. Reform will go through a similar process, but what will happen is eventually there is going to be a merger with the Conservative Party, because the ruling class will want one openly, nakedly reactionary party for themselves, to pose an alternative to Starmer's Labour Party, which is becoming very despised very quickly. And also a merger of Reform and the Tories will not only consolidate like the openly reactionary vote, the ruling class, I think, also hope that a merger between Reform and the Tories will reinvigorate the Labour Party vote when they've disposed of Keir Starmer. So this is a victory which is being massively overstated. The biggest story is not that Reform hammered the two bourgeois parties. The biggest story is that still the great bulk of the working class just simply does not vote in these elections because the working class does not see either any alternative for itself or any point in voting. And that's the much bigger point, rather than this being some kind of heroic victory for Farage. Farage, as I've said before, is promoted by the ruling class media in this country, and he always has been. So he's promoted as an alternative, and that tells you that he's very much not. Look, if they're putting you on Question Time and telling everybody how dangerous you are, most of the time you're not. So, like, Farage is put on Question Time, like, more than anybody else. I think more than any other single politician over the last 20 years, it's Farage, I think, leads the way for Question Time appearances. He's always being denounced on the media. He's always being denounced in the left liberal press. Like, the Trotskyites are obsessed with him because, of course, he's held up as a bogeyman. Now, if they hold you out as a bogeyman, then really they are promoting you. And that's certainly the case with him. It's the same reason why nobody should ever have trusted Russell Brand, because if you're actually a revolutionary, you generally don't get invited for as many softball interviews as that guy got 10 years ago. And the same is true of Nigel Farage. And now there are some cases where, like, a genuinely oppositional figure gets through. Like, for all that I have many criticisms of George Galloway, he used to get on and he would make a few points, get on the news, and he'd get on the political debate shows, particularly when he was mayor for Bethnal Green and Bow, and when he was MP for Bethnal Green and Bow, and when he was an MP for Bradford. He did get on and he would make some points which were quite valid. Same is true for the late leader of ALBA and the SNP, Alex Salmond, not a man whose politics I agreed with on many issues, but he was an oppositional figure who got on TV quite a lot and usually did pretty well in terms of winning an audience over. But the time when even figures like Salmond and Galloway would get on TV, that time's gone now. Now British television is very strictly controlled by the state, meaning that the fact that Farage still gets on, the reforms still get on, even when the control has been drastically tightened up over the last decade, tells you everything you need to know about reform. And those who voted for them, those who got them into councils as the controlling party in a council, will find out very quickly that they are essentially just like the Conservative Party and not that much different from the Labour Party. Right, okay. Hello to T.G. Wilson over there in the faded, ragged glory of France. Right. Molotov Cocktail asks, during the Cold War, there was a propaganda war of images. If we see a Cold War with China, then surely the China with futuristic cities and trains win that image war against the capitalist hell of the USA. I would say, yeah, the war of images is an interesting one, because the futuristic China will probably win that one, because also, like, the US, despite the fact that it has always had its hellish aspects to it, even in its peak period, was always very good at spinning this and creating propaganda. The British are good at it too. Now that's fading away because the material base has withered away. The Chinese traditionally haven't been particularly good at propaganda, though their meme game has dramatically improved recently. And the strongest card they can play is that their model presents a vision of the future, which the US is simply incapable of portraying. The US propaganda war against the Soviets was based on a gigantic amount of bullshitting, though. When you actually boiled it down, the propaganda that they put out there about the amazing capitalist future was always very, 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 very fictional. Now they could just about get away with it because there were elements of there was a very strong industrial and scientific and technological base that the US had for a long time. That's all going away now. So I think Molotov's point is correct, which is that if it's a war of images, the Chinese will probably win that one. And the US imperialists are now too degenerated to invest in a future. It's all just a matter of extracting wealth from as many places as they can. And they can't even build a train line particularly well anymore. Just look at what happened in California. And they cannot they cannot portray themselves as offering an optimistic vision of the future. Yu Wan says, did the West swallow a long, sharp knife in Ukraine? Well, I would say it's certainly the case that they have swallowed they have swallowed a poison pill in Ukraine. They they can't get rid of it. They can't they can't dump Ukraine because that would be too embarrassing. But they know they can't win, so they're just obliged to keep the war going as long as possible. Now, their hope is that eventually, if they do that, that something will come up. As I've said many times before, it won't. And when the defeat comes, and when Kiev falls to the Russians, which I think eventually it will, this will be as probably more devastating than the fall of Saigon 50 years ago. And it will not be something that the US and the British recover from. And also, it will not be something that Donald Trump can recover from, nor anybody else associated with his administration. Lucas says, 5th of May 1818, the great Karl Marx was born. Yes, show specifically on that coming up tomorrow. Irish Partisan says, good evening, comrades. From a cold mince, we're getting ready for Victory Day on May 9th, this Friday. Special Victory Day celebration program coming up May 9th, by the way. Tom Wolfe says, Phil Miller of Declassified UK confronts a British admiral about Britain spying for Israel. Well, I would say this. Britain is not spying for Israel. The British defence and military and intelligence establishment are spying for themselves. Israel is a crucial part of US and British control exercised over the West Asian region, as it has been both in terms of the entire length of the life of the Zionist state, and also prior to that, the Zionist movement, which is, of course, has been backed by British imperialism for an awful long time. So when the British defence establishment engages in intelligence gathering operations to aid Israel, they are acting in the interest of the British ruling class. I disagree completely with the interpretation of Phil Miller and the Declassified UK crew, and the interpretation of Professor David Miller that these people like the defence establishment are spying for a foreign country. That's wrong. More to the point, I think it's a damaging myth to spin. The same way in the United States, the idea that the Zionist tail wags the US dog is also completely wrong. There is a clear and identifiable interest of the British and American and French and German ruling classes in ensuring that the Israeli mass murder spree continues, because it's about securing the continued existence of the State of Israel from internal and external challenges. And if Israel collapses, that is the imperialist position in West Asia fundamentally compromised. So it is in their interests to assist Israel. This is why they're all going mad with repression. This is why they're all going mad with arresting people, and why they've been going crazy with the pro-Israel propaganda for ages, why people get arrested for a tweet. It's because this is a fundamental interest of the British ruling class, and the German ruling class, and the French ruling class, and the US ruling class. And I think those who, like Miller of Declassified and others, who claim that it's these people are aiding a foreign country, this is treason, etc. This is nonsense. This is stuff for the birds. And these people are doing a disservice to their viewers and their readers, because fundamentally, if you want to explain why Israel not only exists, but continues to receive support from the US, the British, and all the imperialist powers, no matter what it does, claiming that the Zionists control the British government and the American government, that's nonsense. That's silly stuff. You're not explaining why the Israeli state continues to be backed. And that is because it is in the interests of the US and the British and others, the ruling classes of these countries, that the movements for nationhood and sovereignty in the Arab world are defeated, that the revolutionary tendencies in Iran are defeated, that the comprador regimes of West Asia are solidified. This is where the interests of the imperialists lie, and you have to explain that. Spinning this myth that the Zionist movement controls Britain and the United States, that again, that's nonsense, and it's actually feeding into ruling class propaganda. And those who are peddling this nonsense need to look at themselves and ask why they're doing that. Hello to Tracy Wilkinson. David King says, what will China's response be if the US attacks the Moscow parade? If the Ukrainians do launch an attack on the Moscow parade, I would be very surprised because, again, the US and the British would fear a Russian response to that. More specifically, they're not the Europeans and the Brits don't want to risk getting themselves in a fight with the Chinese because there's a lot of conflicting agendas regarding China at the moment inside Britain and across the rest of Europe as well. The EU is currently in a row over a trade deal with the Chinese, stuck between like the Trump tariffs, which is the reason why they've reopened negotiations with the Chinese, and the idea of renormalizing their relationship with the PRC. They're not going to be able to do that if they allow Zelensky and the cranks in Kiev to run off and try and ice the Chinese president. Nor do I think the US ruling class, apart from the craziest elements within it, and the craziest elements within the US militarist clique, nor do I think that they particularly want to get themselves involved in a direct shooting war with the Chinese if they ice the Chinese leadership. So for those reasons, I don't think anything's going to happen. I think Zelensky will be quietly told to go and target somewhere else. I think that the Ukrainians, on the instruction of the British and the Americans, will certainly do something on May 9th. Quite what that something is another question. They may target something nearer the border of Ukraine. We may see another border incursion of some significance. Then we may see terrorist attacks on like the Kerch Bridge or something like that. But attack on the Moscow parade, no, because there's too many other big targets there. You've got the president of Brazil, again, who the US has a very sort of conflicted attitude towards. You have other leaders there as well. You have representatives of the Central Asian states and India. Modi's not going, but a senior MOD official from India is going. You have a lot of people there who the US doesn't want to completely alienate. And if the US and the British too have a lot of games going on in the Central Asian region, and the Central Asian leaders are going to be there, I doubt very much that even the British want to burn all their bridges with the Central Asian republics. The British have a lot of games going on there that they want to see fulfilled. So for all those reasons, I think an attack on that parade is a non-starter. Bear in mind, what we've learned in recent weeks, well, what many of us have known for many years now, that Ukrainian attacks on Russia, it's not the SBU and Budanov running out of control. These are attacks which are masterminded from Washington and London. And if Washington and London say no, Kiev doesn't do it. So what I can see happening is that Kiev will stage an attack somewhere in Western Russia that is designed to embarrass the Russian leadership, but they won't attack the Moscow parade. Too risky. Too many big targets there that if even an attack took place on them would have too many devastating consequences for the Europeans and the Americans. So for those reasons, I don't think it will occur. Hello to Richard. Good evening to Burke, who asks, am I excited by Zach Polanski's leadership bid for the Green Party in England and Wales? I have no idea who that is. Burke, you're better informed on this question than I am. You have to let me know who the hell this guy is. Is this the bastard son of Roman Polanski? Is he running for the Green Party leadership? Because the son of a pedo is probably the exact type of guy who the Green Party would put in office. T.G. Wilson says, China has warned France and Britain not to let their puppet try anything on May the 9th in Moscow, apparently. Yeah. Look, they're not going to do it because there's too many conflicting agendas with regard to the Chinese. And if the Chinese have told the French and the British, do this at your peril, I think that will be enough. And I don't think they would have done it anyway. Bear in mind what I said before. the British and the French and the Americans all do fear a direct confrontation with the Russians. But they're desperate enough to try to dance up right to the edge of that. But they're not going to do anything that would actually provoke a direct Russian response. They're going to do an awful lot, but not go that far. Thomas Smitherman said, I have some trouble following the immigration discussion. How do you side with the working class against mass labour migration without being seen as trying to play the bourgeois, fake populist, racist game? You don't, basically. You don't play that game. You have to point out first of all, the causes of migration, but also why the working class is being lied to about what is the cause of their impoverishment. The cause of the impoverishment of the British working class is not mass migration, never has been. Doesn't matter whether it's the last 10 years, last 20 years, last 50 years, or last 200 years. And this is why I pointed out when I was talking about the migration question recently, the British ruling class and now the American ruling class and the French and the Germans, name your poison, have always falsely pointed to migration as being the problem and being the reason why working class living standards are collapsing. That isn't the reason why they're collapsing. The living standards of the British working class got frozen in terms of wage increases by the early 1980s. This is before the period of increased migration from various different parts of the world that occurred from the late 80s, early 90s onwards. So decline in the wages of the working class, decline in the conditions of the working class, the diminishing of the worsening of the jobs that are available to British workers, the casualisation of employment conditions. This is not caused by immigration. It's caused by the downward pressure the class war waged upon the working class by the ruling class. It started long before the modern migration patterns began. And so what we have to point out is that the working class has been consistently lied to. The working class has been given the immigration question as something that the class is told over and over again, get mad about that. Get mad about that. And that's the gamble that the ruling class takes. The ruling class does need significant numbers of migrant workers to come into the imperialist nations every year and work for ultra cheap wages. They need that. At the same time, they need to reinforce as many divisions between the pre-existing working class population and the newly arrived workers. Hence, this is one of the reasons why you get so much relentless propaganda, because they need to make sure that as many divisions are reinforced within the working class as possible. So you have to tell the working class the real reason for them being impoverished, and it is not immigration. It is the workings of the capitalist system. Now, do I expect that the great masses of the working class in Britain or the United States are going to accept that overnight? No. It's hard to overcome generation after generation of bourgeois propaganda, but we have to overcome it. We can't lie to them, which is what the pseudo-populists and the racists are doing. We can't pretend, and we must never pretend, that it is the fault of one section of the working class that the rest of the working class is being impoverished. It is the direct result of a rotting system which cannot deliver upon a better standard of living for the working class or the next generation of the working class. And that is what we must be honest about. And the only unity of the entire working class is going to be able to secure us a way out of this mess. Otherwise, what we're doing is we're just damaging the ability of the working class to actually unify and overthrow the bourgeoisie, which is what we want. And so we must be honest, and we must be direct and straightforward. We mustn't talk down to people or scream that they're racist or anything like that, but we must be absolutely honest and direct with them. And they might not accept it today or tomorrow, but eventually events will prove us correct. And if we do our job well, we will be in a position to rapidly grow our parties when the working class does realize the truth, as they inevitably will, when all of these fake populist parties get into office and fundamentally don't do anything. They don't do anything about the things that they say are their primary concern, because They won't defy the whim of the ruling class. Now, if we talk about the border controls of a country after the bourgeoisie has been dispossessed, after the bourgeoisie has been thrown out of power, after imperialism has been destroyed, then that's a different conversation. But our task at the current moment is to ensure that the working class realizes the truth about its situation. Hello to David Ball, Just a Maverick, Ben from Hungary, Bill Tavern, who says, remember 300 Spartans? Well, I remember the movie 300. A much, much more gay film than Top Gun. Right. Just going through some messages here. Ben says, or asks rather, why are trads and rightists celebrating the Romanian elections? Simeon is an MEP, member of the ECR, where you only get in if you're a full-blown Atlanticist neocon. Don't they see the game? No, they don't. Look, trads and rightists are, despite the fact that these people get things right occasionally, they are fundamentally idealists and are therefore very easily confused. You stick somebody in front of them who says that they're for the nation, they wave the flag, they reject globalism, that fake term, and that they criticize like the EU and they criticize the US, and they say they're for sovereignty and independence. And a lot of these trads and rightists, as Ben puts it in his question, will swallow that pill whole without ever looking at what the ingredients are. Simeon is, and Ben's right, he's like a long time member of the Romanian political establishment. He's a long time member of the European Parliament. So why is this guy some kind of radical? He's not. He's realized that the moment has come to dress himself in new political garb. But like the trads and the rightists celebrating this haven't looked at anything other than like the surface level. They haven't looked at this guy's political allegiances. They haven't looked at what his record is. And they're just because they're not materialists, because they're anti-materialists, because they're like romantic reactionaries, they will be always easily won over by aesthetics. And that's what happens with a lot of these like characters who sometimes can call things out correctly. They'll look at like the rotten culture and the disintegrating systems of the West, and they'll accurately point to some of the symptoms of the morbid symptoms of our time, but ask them to analyze and look at a way out of this, and they'll just come up with like all kinds of strange, backward-looking and reactionary ideas, like a restoration of Catholicism, or return to tradition, or bringing back monarchies, or something stupid. Because this is what happens when you're enamored with like reactionary idealism. You think that like a restoration of the right kind of aesthetics will somehow reverse the process of decline, whereas in actual fact that's a completely backwards way of thinking. Just a Maverick says, it is clear that Russia was not prepared for war. Militarily speaking, they had kept the army small with elite special forces. It took them the first 2 years of the war to gear up. Largely, I agree with Just a Maverick. They thought that they could achieve a rapid victory by essentially compelling the Kiev regime to back down and swear to neutrality. It almost worked, but I think that any document that the Kiev regime signed should not have been taken particularly seriously, because ultimately they weren't in charge of their own destiny. This is not a sovereign country. This is a country which is run from London and Washington, mostly. Paris and Berlin have their influence too, but it's essentially a London-Washington operation. They're the ones in charge. It's not Zelensky. It wasn't Poroshenko either. It's not even the Maidan crew and the Nazis. It's London and Washington. They're the ones who pay the bills. They're the ones who reorganize the government, the military, the intelligence services. They're the ones who run the war. They're the ones who make the decisions. So it is quite clear that any agreement that the Kiev regime signed would not have been worth the paper it was written on. The Russians weren't naive. They were reflecting the point of view of the Russian bourgeoisie, which is desperate to have certain of its interests respected, which of course the imperialists won't do, but also desperate to keep its trading and banking and purchasing relations open with the West. So they were looking for a quick deal as soon as possible. The kind that they got in Georgia didn't work. And so as time went on, the Russian government was forced to restore more and more Soviet systems. They've now apparently had to restore the old Soviet mobilization system. They've had to turn to traditional Soviet era alliances. They've had to well, they didn't have to bring in, but they've brought in soldiery from the DPRK and have been amazed by the fighting ability of the DPRK soldiers. So the Russian bourgeois and the Russian system has been forced into making continual concessions, or should we say, continual restorations of the Soviet era. So much so that, like, the KPRF are gaining an influence in both the armed forces and amongst the youth of Russian society, and the Russian bourgeois have been losing influence. And this is the reason. This is one of the reasons why they absolutely did not want this war, but it is a war that has been forced on them, and it's a war that I think the Russian masses expect the Putin-led government to fight to a conclusion. And if they don't, then there will be trouble for the Putin government. So, yes, they were unprepared. They have been forced into militarization and a restoration of certain elements of the Soviet period. It's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out. Hello to David Greenwood. Let's see who else is here. Just a Maverick says, I don't believe Alex is accounting for their extreme irrationality. These people are absolute lunatics. They're not. Look, be wary of using terms like lunatic to describe, like, the Kiev regime is a puppet regime. What it does because it is told to do. Like, it is absolutely dependent upon London and Washington. London and Washington are afraid of the Russian military. They know that they can't counter it themselves. It's the reason why Keir Starmer shit his pants and had to back down over sending troops to Ukraine. It's the reason why Biden and Trump can't and won't deploy forces to Ukraine. So these people aren't completely insane. They know that they can't win an encounter with the Russians. And the Ukrainian regime does what it's told. If they're told, no, don't fucking do that, do something else, they'll do it. Now, are there elements in the Ukrainian regime that are just crazy and might try and do something? Well, maybe. But most of those people are, again, trained and equipped and organized by the British. And the British don't want to risk a full-blown confrontation with the Russians. And so what they'll do is they'll do something else other than attack that parade on May 9th. I am almost convinced of that. Thomas Smitherman says, Georgescu himself was some elite Eurocrat. Yeah, look, all of these people are products of, like, a reactionary system in Romania. Like, so Georgescu said a couple of things that was, like, vaguely critical or quite critical of, like, the EU and the war in Ukraine. So there's nothing to say that a man who's been in the EU bureaucracy can't develop critical thoughts about it. So let's not rule that out. But none of them are like radicals to any degree. Like, they are sort of right-wing reactionary figures who have sort of developed a kind of, like, Orban-esque approach to these things, but without any of Orban's seriousness or ability to organize an independent political base. Mo1917 says the big bourgeoisie likes keeping the home countries of migrants poor and sources of raw material and labor. The imposed austerity is what drives migration. Our class interests are the same globally. Very good point. Ben says Hungary is also close to the Polish post-People's Republic model, shrinking since 1982 despite state-sponsored patriotic Catholicism here. Yeah, it doesn't work because you can't bullshit your way to a higher birth rate. You know, the working class knows and understands fundamentally what's in their interest and whether a state is operating in their interests or not. They might be confused about the future. They might not know the way forward. But people understand instinctively and know from the look of their bank balance whether a country is run in their interests or not. And the only thing that restoration of capitalism in all of the Eastern European countries has done is immiserate the working class and wage relentless war on them. Orban is clever enough to realize that that might be a problem, but because he's a pro-capitalist, he can't do anything about it. Not really. Yes, Hungary has a better birth rate than the Baltic states, but so does a man on his own in a phone box. A Name says, good afternoon from San Joaquin Valley, comrades. Thank you for joining us. Right, let's see how many we got here. We have 163 of you on X, 188 of you on YouTube, 2 on Rumble, 3 on Rumble. It's just gone up. 1 on Locals, 1 on Twitch. Be sure to check out the other platforms and subscribe to them if you haven't done so already. So, who else we got here? Ben agreed with the point about bourgeois nationalists and have never been nationalists. Well, they were at some point. Look, bourgeois nationalism in like a country like Britain or France, at a certain point, represented a progressive force. So, like bourgeois nationalism in England, in the post-Civil War period, the Cromwellian dictatorship, the period where they unified the nation, to build up an industrial base. That kind of like nationalism, even in perfidious Albion, played a progressive role in terms of unifying unifying the nation and building up an industrial base. Same in France, same in Italy. Even though that was a sort of distorted process that was rather geographically unbalanced in terms of industrialization. So there's a progressive element in bourgeois nationalism. One could even argue that Polish nationalism at a certain point contained progressive elements within it. But Polish nationalism post 1989 is Polish bourgeois nationalism is an utterly regressive force, because Poland, for all the flaws of the Polish People's Republic, and there were certainly flaws, still created a better society than that which followed it. It's why you've had mass migration out of Poland since 1989. It's why the industrial base has collapsed, the birth rate has collapsed, and the Polish bourgeoisie just keeps bullshitting. So bourgeois nationalism now is a regressive, reactionary force in most of the European countries. It's a wretched reactionary force. Is in the imperialist countries, it's an utterly despicable, rotten force, because it's the nationalism of a backward, out of date class that covers up the fact that it's rancid and corrupt and incapable of taking the nation forward by waving the flag and screaming about national pride and damn the immigrants and stuff like that, whilst the class that creates this fake nationalism is only draining the nation of resources and corroding it with its rotten parasitic culture. That's what's going on with bourgeois nationalism, and that's true in the imperialist countries. It's even more true in the countries which are dominated by imperialism. Like Ukrainian so-called nationalism is the worst example of this. Absolutely, completely and utterly regressive form of nationalism, because it represents a completely and utterly bankrupt system. What Ukrainian capitalism? What the fuck is that? Same with Russia. You've come out of a higher form of economic development and political development and collapsed into a lower form. So how could it ever be anything other than reactionary and regressive and a fake nationalism, which is only designed to cover up the subjugation of a nation under the boot heel of imperialism? I have nothing but contempt for this nationalism, because it's worthy only of contempt. All it has done is provide an ideological cover for the subjugation of a nation like Poland to US imperialism. And all these fake assholes like Donald Tusk, Duda, Miskovitz, and others should be exposed for what they are, which is just complete and total frauds. Caustic Grip, hello to you. Zouter, evening to you. Caustic Grip says, nationalist idealism is only possible under the conditions of the continued existence of imperialism. It's the opium of the masses that is fed to the people by the comprador elite. Good point. let's just go through. Go through some stuff here. Just going through some stuff. Right, hello to Muzzle Paint, Slumbering Colossus. Let's go through some. Ben liked the answer on the Romanian elections. Using the UK example, okay. Let's carry on going through. Hello to Comrade Marius. Pavel says, "How do you see the risk of AI and digital currency in Europe to organizing? If the risk is real, how do we overcome this?" Look, the risk of like pure digitization is that, of course, that they can cut you off quite easily from sources of income. Now, that is a risk. It's always been a risk. They could, I mean, they're always looking to tighten up upon individuals' ability to exist within the system. I mean, but they've always had abilities to do that. They've always run blacklists. They've always like tried to debank or to confiscate assets of anybody who's an oppositionist. And so you have to find ways around it. And there are ways around it. Look, you can fund your you can fund comrades who are debanked and blacklisted via sympathizer networks who don't appear to be connected to a party or an organization. Every time the bourgeoisie puts up a barrier, revolutionaries can find a way around it. I'm sure that when it comes to digital currency and like purely online banking systems, there's ways around that. You can have like your clean skins do all the financial stuff and move money around in ways that are hard for the state to trace. There's always a way around what the state does. I am not overly worried about these things, to be completely honest. It's not the risk to organizing that many people think. And the reason why I don't talk about that too much is because there's too many people who get obsessed with AI and get obsessed with digital currencies keep screaming that if once that this comes in, oh, it's game over, they'll control everything. Well, that's not the case. These people are people get too hysterical at this sort of thing. We are a naturally innovative creatures by our very nature, and I think we could quite easily get around the restrictions the bourgeoisie puts on. Bear in mind, the bourgeoisie, every time they put restrictions on, also affect themselves, because much of their money making is borderline criminal, if not outright criminal, by their own laws. So the ruling class themselves won't particularly like too restrictive laws when it comes to banking and finance. We have to bear that in mind as well. Salon No Mind says, is it better for someone who believes in the party line of Marxism-Leninism to succeed in their field and become an advocate, or to give their life to the party? Well, you can be very successful in a particular field of work and give your life to the party. Such people are very useful. And I don't just mean in terms of working for the party. I mean in terms of providing finances for the party, providing services to the party, writing for the party. You can become somebody who's very successful in a particular career and be someone who's very useful to a revolutionary party. In fact, such comrades are very valuable who have particular skills that they've learned in one of the bourgeois professions, who either technical or practical skills. So there's no sharp line to be drawn between the two. Zouter says the quote-unquote outsider position is going to be perpetually favoured in British politics. Having power demonstrates how powerless the House of Commons is. Yes, I mean, I would say that the outsider, appearing to be an outsider, has been the favoured position of even the bourgeois parties since the 60s. Being establishment has not been a vote winner since like the days of Alec Douglas Hume. So it's something that both Thatcher and Blair did, was to portray themselves as outsiders battling some fictional elite. Farage is doing the same thing. It's just another version of the same old trick. But the trick only lasts so long before the working class works out that all of these oppositional figures have all been fake. Risto Kostadinov says what the Eastern Bloc didn't have is World Wide Web, where people could see that these places are countries where people do live normal lives, and is not whatever the fuck Robert Conquest wrote. Or Timothy Snyder. Could you elaborate on what you believe the best strategy would be to win over an uneducated worker who has been tricked to believe in the JQ racial nonsense as the root of his alienation? Asks Cooper Ward. Assuming he has no clue what communism is and loosely associates it with McCarthy images and culture war nonsense. Well, you can't win over such people by agitation alone. Agitation only plants seeds. It's up to the bourgeoisie themselves and the class war to water those seeds and cause them to grow into plants. What we can do is put the truth out there and seek to win over those layers within it and those elements within the working class who are already developed a critical attitude towards the current system. For those who are more backward and believe the nonsense, all we can do is essentially keep advocating for our position, keep telling them the truth. They will reject it and reject it and reject it until the class war that is waged upon them hits them in the face, and then suddenly they will actually start to look for other causes of their alienation. So at the moment, it's a matter of actually patiently advocating for our position and getting ready for the moment when the bourgeoisie ups the scale of the class war to the point where the more backward layers of the working class are prepared to actually listen. At the moment, we are planting seeds. We're trying to win over the advanced workers. We are putting our propaganda out there, and we're not going to win over the more backward layers immediately. We need to accept that. It's a matter of identifying the organic intellectuals of the working class, or training the organic intellectuals of the working class, making sure that we've got as many worker communists as possible spread across the working class of the United States, Britain, or wherever. And so when the crisis intensifies and the class war upon workers hits another level of repressiveness and brutality, that we have worker communists in place to reach those more backward layers and reach them with a truth that they will then be ready to hear. At the moment, I think some comrades, and this is inevitable given the very, very backward stage we're coming out of, some comrades get lost between what our actual task is. Our actual task is to build our organizations by building up organic intellectuals of the working class, by creating more worker communist intellectuals. And that's our job right now. So it's a limited and very difficult job. But once you've done it and you have that network and that party network in place, then we can be ready to win over the masses on a much bigger scale. Some comrades get impatient and want to leap to the point where you're winning over all of these workers who have all these contradictory and often backward opinions. We're not going to win those people over straight away. This is our ambitions at this stage should be building solid and near unbreakable organizations based on very highly politically educated and well-developed cadres. That's what we've got to do at the moment. Mm. 70 Israeli airstrikes on Yemen today, says Just a Maverick. Yeah, and it doesn't do them any good whatsoever. Just going through here. Right, I am just going to be doing something here in the chat, so bear with me just a moment. If you can just hang on. Be sure to like and share the stream if you haven't done so already. I am Just doing some engineering work, shall we say, due to a chat malfunction. Okay, that's not working. Right, we're going to have to carry on. Otherwise, chat malfunction notwithstanding. Zelensky might go out like Scarface. I doubt he's got the balls, to be honest. He's a puppet. Zelensky is an actor with lines written for him by the British and the Americans. Right. Just going through some more comments here. Rentier Oligarch says conservatives MAGA are ultimately too cowardly to actually challenge the ruling class. Easier to yell at impoverished migrants. I wouldn't say too cowardly. I would say that it depends on who you're talking about. Like pissed off workers who vote for Trump think that it's an act of rebellion. It's not. The petty bourgeois and lower bourgeois types who vote for Trump want the aesthetics of change without anything actually changing. Ash says, do you see what happened in the Australian election? It was an unexpected Labour landslide. The Greens had a disastrous night and the Liberals are in shambles, but the Nationals rural party holds strong. Haven't caught up with the Australian election yet. I'll have to have a look at it. Wasn't it some of it down to the fact that Peter Dutton, the Liberal national leader, was completely and utterly useless, more so even than the likes of Keir Starmer or Kemi Badenoch in this country? I haven't caught up with it completely yet, but I will return to it probably next week. Right, just going through some more. Enigmatician says, why was Tukhachevsky executed? Because he was a fascist traitor. There you go. Quick answer for you there. Let's go through some more elements of questions here. Still trying. Yeah, the chat function is malfunctioning tonight. So if something's gone wrong, then let me know. Right. Right, I'm going to have to revisit that as time goes on. Okay, right, so. Right. Yeah, I mean, the argument about AI and stuff like that is, and the AI is going to control everything. I mean, this techno-dystopianism is silly. Every other major innovation over the last 150 to 200 years has been used by the capitalists to do the same thing, which is lay off one layer of workers who cost too much, throw them into impoverishment, then employ a lower skilled, lower paid workers in their place. That's what technology is used for under capitalism, because capitalists can't get away from needing wage labor to ultimately derive their profit from. And so, no, I do not agree with those who are sort of those running around screaming that the sky is falling in. Molotov Cocktail says, or asks rather, would Labour losing so badly make them or the ruling class think about throwing some concessions down? No. Precisely, I mean, they might try and make fake concessions, but not real ones. The system's too far gone to make concessions these days. Now, the only way you get concessions these days is if there would be the working class literally had a gun to the head of the ruling class, and by that stage, well, we might as well just go all the whole way and get rid of them. Right. No, I mean, I don't. I mean, AI writing books, AI making movies, AI will generate content that is derivative of the existing content, and the existing content is already shite. So AI will make shite out of shite, and without the human input there, without human creativity, it can't do anything. Do I have any opinion on Ibrahim Traore? The US and the EU seem pretty worked up with him since he kicked the French out of Burkina Faso. Yes, he is the heir to. He's the heir to Thomas Sankara in so many ways, and that is why, of course, the US and the French in particular are going absolutely fucking crackers over him, and that's why the revolutionary process in Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and Chad, to a degree, has to be supported by communists in the West, because this is a crucial next phase of the decolonization of the African nations. Okay, right. So, going to draw things to a conclusion for tonight. Come back tomorrow for another episode of the program. There'll be the Decline and Fall special on the 26th anniversary of the bombing in Yugoslavia by the criminal NATO alliance. Will be out later this week, so keep your eyes peeled for that one. I'll be back again with you tomorrow. Thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. I'll be back with you again soon, but until then, good night.